Hello and welcome to Demand-Driven Matters, the podcast that addresses all things related to demand-driven manufacturing. This is the fourth installment in our series, The 5 Key Elements to Drive Flow. Today we're going to focus on extend to the supply chain. My name is Pam Bednar. I'm your facilitator today, and our guest is John Maher, Vice President of Product Strategy for Synchronizing Manufacturing Software. John has over 20 years of experience in various manufacturing environments as well as various manufacturing systems. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Pam. Happy to be here.
So let's just remind everybody of how we perceive demand-driven manufacturing. Our definition is demand-driven manufacturing enables a synchronized closed loop between customer orders, production scheduling, and manufacturing execution, all while synchronizing the flow of materials and resources across the supply chain. The key components are synchronization and flow. And as you know, flow is the focus of the series of episodes. Previously, we've discussed elements 1 through 3, and today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the fourth element of driving flow, extend to the supply chain. Here are the 4 key points that we'll highlight in our discussion. In our second podcast in the series, we talked about synchronizing activities and aligning production planning, scheduling, and execution by synchronizing people, processes, machines, and materials. And extend to the supply chain, the focus is on synchronizing activities from the factory out so that material flow and replenishment signals are in line with production flow. Here's a fairly simplistic view of the landscape. We're going to get into some more complex environments in a moment. So John, can you talk a little bit about your experience working with manufacturers to synchronize activities beyond the 4 walls?
Sure, Pam. I think it's important when we talk about this concept of synchronizing the supply chain from the factory out, like why do we say that's important? And really, it's twofold why it's important to first start in the factory. One is that to allow your suppliers to be more effective, you need to resolve the noise and the chaos that you're inflicting upon them. And the second is to have a credibility with the suppliers when you try and extend to them. You have to first have your own house in order. So you have to gain that credibility by showing that you're stable and capable and by stop inflicting all the pain on them. And then once you do that, you've earned the credibility to move on.
That makes great sense, John. How would you get the suppliers on board with this concept?
The way the suppliers react are really, there's kind of 3 different reactions that our customers see when they start extending it to their suppliers. One is the suppliers who are on a demand-driven manufacturing path themselves may even be further than the customer is. Their response is typically finally, right? Finally, you're coming on board and you're going to be in lockstep with us. Another reaction is suppliers who aren't really demand-driven. They know something about it or maybe don't, but they're intrigued by it and want to learn more. And the most effective thing that we've seen with our customers is that as our customers have already learned by synchronizing their factory and implementing demand-driven in their factory, they really start to help out their suppliers, help them with education and inviting them in to show them what they're doing for demand-driven to help them get to that point where they can start implementing demand-driven. And, you can say, well, it's my supplier's business. Why do I have to give them free consulting? But this is one of those points in life where there's direct causality between how effective they are and how effective you can be, and any additional costs that they're incurring are ultimately going to be passed on to you. And then the final reaction that I would say is, suppliers who are still living in that past where push-based manufacturing is really the right way to do it. They're all about running the largest batches possible. For those environments, you don't really have other options as far as suppliers, and they don't want to go down the demand-driven path. Ultimately, they're just going to keep a pile of inventory sitting there and waiting to send you on a demand-driven basis, right? And sooner or later, something's going to have to give as far as that supplier goes, because them keeping all that inventory and running in that old paradigm of push manufacturing is ultimately going to cost you more. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point a manufacturer who's a bit further down the path of demand-driven is going to be able to come in and way outperform them.
Okay, so John, the point is that when activities are synchronized across your enterprise and supplier network, your replenishment signals, material flow, status, supplier performance, all of that is coming together to really drive flow.
Correct, Ben. And, you know, when it comes to proactive communication, I'm sure that there's lots of organizations who consider that they're doing proactive communication to their suppliers. Unfortunately, a lot of time it's just really their proactive communication is like constantly hounding their suppliers about things and constantly changing priorities. So, yeah, so this is really where synchronization and flow come into play. One is that really as you're synchronizing and driving flow in your factory, one thing to realize is that the external supply chain at some point is going to become kind of like your constraint, right? Because external suppliers are going to be a big part of delivering what you need when you need it. So when you release stuff to your manufacturing process, it can flow through unencumbered. So being able to achieve this and synchronize out to suppliers is going to be critical in your move towards demand-driven manufacturing. So that being said, after you've stabilized, synchronized, and driven flow within your environment, then proactive communication becomes easier and more targeted and better with each step in the journey towards demand-driven. With every step that you take, there's going to be more clarity around priority and what's really important to the organization, and you know, ultimately you want to share this clarity on priority and what you're working with your customers. So in order to proactively communicate, I think that part of it is really getting to more of an electronic means, right? And again, I want to point out that getting your factory synchronized is critical, because if you're just giving them poor information faster and more readily, that's not going to help the supply chain. What's really going to help the supply chain is when you reach that level of stability and synchronization, that you're going to continue to iterate and get better on it, but then you're going to start exposing the suppliers to it so that they can stay in lockstep with what you're trying to do internally. And really what that's going to do is it's going to feel like it's decreasing the amount of communication to you and between you and your supplier, because it's going to decrease the actual manual interaction between you and your suppliers. And it's really going to be about proactive sharing of information and then having proactive communication when something doesn't go quite
right. You're eliminating the chaos,
yes,
the chaotic emails and phone calls to juggle priorities and such,
yes,
and really streamlining it. Sounds like it would make everybody's life a lot easier.
definitely.
John, many of our listeners are in very highly complex environments, multinational enterprises, even 100 times more complex than what's pictured here. So what advice or best practices can you offer in these complex environments for driving flow through the supply chain?
Sure. Many of our customers would look, you know, similar to this. If you look at these environments, our customers that have a multitude of entities that are scattered across the globe and that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of supply chain transactions going on, if you look at them from that standpoint, they would be considered very, very complex in what they have to orchestrate in and every day. And one of the things that's important to separate is execution of the process and management of the process. And the execution of the process, the number of transactions are just going to be what the number of transactions are. But management of the process is really what we're talking about as far as whether something feels really complex or really simple. And really it's in many of these environments where management and execution are almost overlapped, where virtually every replenishment signal needs to be managed through the entire process and kept on track of and constantly communicating with your supplier about in order for those things to come to fruition. So the main point of advice that I would give around it is that, one, again, getting back to that stability, synchronization, and driving flow for the manufacturing plants that are internal to your supply chain, doing that so that you're reducing that chaos and noise that you're spreading out to the rest of the environment. Number two is automate and simplify this execution process. And this is going to help you to get to where it starts feeling like it's a more simplified environment. And from a items that may be on replenishment standpoint, this involves getting into longer-term arrangements with the suppliers so that you can automate that signal, so that really what you're doing is setting up a trusted system that you know is going to be automatically sending out signals to your suppliers, all based around that longer-term contract. So at that point, once the system's set up, these transactions are just occurring. These signals are just occurring through the process rather than people have to get manually involved in each and every execution signal that occurs. And then the third thing would then be to give visibility. This is really about once you've stabilized, synchronized, and automated the execution process, is to give them that real-time visibility into your environment. Again, once you've done this stabilization, that's going to be good information for them. It's not going to be information that is just sending them off in a spiral of different directions, because they're no longer going to be managing within the noise. They're going to understand when priorities change, that that's a real change. When something needs to be expedited, that that's a real expedite signal that they see. With Synchronized Supplier Portal, what we find over and over again is that communication from suppliers is, look, we spend more time interacting with the portal, but overall to our organization, it's a net in time, because this visibility is given to us so we can stay in alignment with priorities. We can stop having the meetings, the phone calls, the constant chaos and churn that's created in a non-demand-driven environment. And then really the fourth and final best practice, I would say, is really get down to managing by exception. Simplicity, the way that you make this complex environment feel simple to be interacting with, is get to that point where you have the trusted system that's executing on the supply chain. Get to the point where you have a stable enough process so that you understand the difference between normal and abnormal variability within the process, and then only get involved when you have that special cause variability that occurs. And, you know, you can say you're managing by exception, but if it is just noise, then you're not truly managing in the exception. And I would say as a benchmark, you know, if you're having to get involved with greater than, let's say, 2 to 5% of the overall transactions within the supply chain, you're not managing by exception. And the more stuff that you try and manage, the less effective you're going to be at managing it.
Perfect. I like that data point. I also like the distinction that you made between execution and management. I think that's strong. Any other kind of quantifiable nuggets that you can share with our listeners based on your experience, for example, in terms of, you know, how many transactions some clients have been able to reduce, or number of POs? I think there's you know, certainly a lot of inherent value just in the process streamlining, but you know, there's a lot of residual benefits that clients can achieve as well.
Sure. I'll give you a concrete example of a customer of ours whose supply chain really looked a lot like the previous slide. You know, again, multitude of sites scattered around the globe, all suppliers and customers to one another, and then thousands upon thousands of external suppliers as well within their supply chain. And their director of supply chain has given us feedback that one of the things that he's experienced is really the simplification of his supply chain. And to give you some hard numbers about what this looks like, by automating the execution of their supply chain transactions, what they were able to accomplish was an 83% reduction in manual purchase order lines being created within their environment. And you combine that with true exceptions management of them getting involved and only getting involved in that 2 to 5% of the transactions that are occurring, greatly reduce the level of workload on their people to where they have found that they've been able to increase the productivity of their purchasing group by greater than 60%. So this means that, however you want to look at it, they can take on 60%, more work, or that 60% less cost into your organization. And this is not people working harder. It's people being more effective at what they do. And then also their feedback from their suppliers has been that they're ecstatic with the capabilities provided to them, because they're not constantly getting pulled around by the organization anymore. They can focus on running their business without our customers' business constantly disrupting what they're trying to do.
Those are pretty impressive numbers. If you translated that into dollars, that would be highly significant. John, can you talk a little bit about the third bullet, the contrast between long-term planning and consumption-based on-demand execution?
Yes, Pam. If you take a look at this from a long-term planning standpoint, and if you take a look at forecasts, right, you need to be able to establish these longer-term relationships with your suppliers through a contract or blanket purchase order. You really need to have some sort of projection on what you expect to buy from them over the course of a period of time, right? And this is really where a forecast comes into play, so that they can plan what they're going to need for capacity and capabilities to support your business. The key thing here, though, is that when it comes to execution, the execution needs to be demand-driven. So you may set up like the sizing of your replenishment buffers based on forecasts, but when it comes time to actual execution, at that point, it's very important to not be building the forecast, to truly be building to the take one, you make one philosophy, where you aren't building more until actual consumption happens. So this is really using that forecast to make sure that you're protecting yourself as far as what you expect to happen, but when it comes time to execute against it, that you're actually driving to what the market is actually consuming from you and taking from you, so that your replenishment stays in lockstep with what demand is actually occurring.
Got it. Thanks, John. Just anecdotally to validate what we've been discussing, Gartner and other industry experts report hearing from manufacturers a strong need for greater collaboration and visibility across the supply chain. Here you see that they're ranked number 1 and number 2. So John, here's a snapshot of the benefits of greater supply chain collaboration and synchronization. How would a manufacturer go about creating a more collaborative supply chain? Are there best practices for doing such? I know we've touched on a couple, but maybe you can just summarize some of your advice or tips for our audience.
I think this is a very good graphic as far as what people can expect by making this move and taking on this journey. The main thing that I would say for you, especially if you're in an environment that kind of looks like that complex supply chain that we showed earlier, right? The things I would say to you, as well as single location manufacturers, is really one, to get started. It sounds like a easy and straightforward concept, but the point is that if you take a look at that whole, it can be very overwhelming to, one, know where to start, two, to try and tackle that entire piece. So, really, to me, it's about getting started. You can start small, and then from there, it's about constantly iterating, expanding, evolving, improving the overall process. Each step in the process, you're going to improve, and you're going to see the benefits of that, and you're also going to find things that you didn't quite do right or things that can be improved upon. But the point is, you're never going to come up with a perfect plan. So come up with that good enough plan. Start small, iterate through it, and make sure that you automate before you get to a point where the burden of doing the work becomes more than the system can handle. I've seen far too many of an environment where they try and do everything manually, and they just get to a point where the administration, right, the thing that you really can't improve upon is that big game that I talked about by automating the execution signal. If you stay with manual, the more that program expands, you're going to have a linear increase in the amount of work that people have to do.
Sure.
So it's important to automate at the appropriate time before the initiative begins to stall because of the effort to keep up with things.
Right.
The software tools can help you to kind of have that framework to huddle everyone around to put in place. And also, you're never going to achieve that true supply chain visibility without having the tools.
You know, John, I know a lot of manufacturers have used manual means of tracking inventory, tracking materials and such. Is there a benchmark that you have in mind, or, you know, that at point X people need to start digitizing their environment or automating their systems?
It really comes down to the organization and how it's structured. You really have to ask yourself at each point in the journey how much you're taking on workload-wise by it being a manual system. And, you know, it would be a good time to start talking with software companies that are out there about where you're at in your journey so that they can help you understand what their software is going to improve for you.
Or what the process is going to be like or change. Okay, let's wrap it up here. So once again, there's many resources related to the topic today at synchrono.com/resources. Next up in our series is the final installment, Aligning Metrics. So we'll specifically talk about 4 categories of metrics that matter in demand-driven manufacturing operations. We hope you will join us. Thank you, John, for your time today and all your valuable insights, and we hope that you'll join us for the next episode.
Thanks, Pam. It was my pleasure.